The diner sat at the edge of Harlan, like something the town had forgotten to finish. Its sign buzzed in the dark, one letter always threatening to go out, and the parking lot cracked along old frost lines that nobody had ever bothered to fill. Hollow Creek Diner opened 24 hours, established 1971. The kind of place that did not need to advertise because the people who needed it always found it eventually. Nora Calloway had found it at 17, showed up with a backpack and no references, and a face that made Floyd Briggs, the night cook, ask her twice if she had somewhere to be. She told him she was exactly where she needed to be. He hired her on the spot and regretted it for approximately 3 days before deciding she was the best thing that had walked through that door in a decade. Now she was 24 and she still worked the same shift, 10 at night until 6 in the morning. Tuesday through Saturday, sometimes Sunday if Carla called in sick, which Carla did with impressive regularity. The shift paid less than the lunch crowd tips, but more than the alternatives, and Nora had spent 7 years building a life around alternatives. She was not tall. 5'4" in her work shoes with red-brown hair, she kept in a braid because the diner had no air conditioning worth mentioning, and the kitchen put out heat like a second sun. Her eyes were the color of creek water in early spring, greenish and clear, with a watchfulness behind them that people sometimes mistook for coldness. It was not coldness, it was attention. There was a difference, though. Not everybody knew it. She had a small scar above her left eyebrow from a screen door that swung back wrong when she was 9. She had hands that moved efficiently, never dropping anything, never wasting motion, the kind of hands that learned young how to work without being praised for it. She had a laugh that surprised people because it came out bigger than she looked, sudden and real, and it made the old farmers at the counter straighten up a little every time they heard it. Floyd said Nora had the best instincts of anybody he had ever worked with. He said it the way old men said things they meant, but would not repeat too often for fear of sounding soft. He said it once she heard it, and that was enough for both of them. The town of Harlan sat in a valley in eastern Kentucky where the hills closed in on 3 sides and the roads in and out required patience. It was not a poor town exactly, but it was a town that knew what shortage felt like, in its bones, the kind of knowing that got passed down through kitchens and work boots and the particular silence that fell around dinner tables when numbers did not add up. People there did not dramatize hardship. They just lived around it. There was one stoplight, one pharmacy, one hardware store that also sold fishing licenses and birthday cards. There was the sheriff's department on First Street run by Dale Pruitt, who had been sheriff for 16 years and who had the comfortable certainty of a man who had never been seriously wrong about anything important in a place where nothing important had recently gone wrong. There was Hollow Creek Diner open, always smelling of coffee and bacon grease, and the particular cinnamon pine air freshener that Nora had chosen herself from the dollar store 3 years ago and replaced faithfully ever since. And 4 blocks north past the hardware store and the old savings bank that now sold insurance, there was a low concrete building with a gravel lot and a hand-painted sign that said Iron Shepherd Garage and Service. The building had once been a tire warehouse. It still smelled faintly of rubber and metal filings, and the men who worked inside it had the quiet, contained manner of people who had learned somewhere difficult that noise was usually a waste. Iron Shepherd MC had been in Harlan for 11 years, 43 members, most of them veterans, most of them past 40, several of them considerably past it. They did engine work restoration, some fabrication. They ran a charity ride every October for the County Children's Hospital. They did not bother people, and people had learned somewhat slowly in a few cases not to bother them. Their president was a man named Decker Holt, 52 years old, with the kind of face that suggested it had been broken and reset at least once, and had come back harder for it. He had served 2 tours with the Marine Corps, lost 2 fingers on his left hand to a vehicle fire in the Gulf, and had been running this garage for a decade with the methodical patience of someone who understood that engines and people both failed for the same basic reason: too much pressure applied to something that was not designed to carry it. He came into the diner on Tuesday and Thursday mornings at 5:45 after the overnight work was done and before the town woke up. He sat at the far end of the counter, ordered black coffee and eggs over easy, and read whatever paperwork he had brought with him. He did not make conversation except to answer direct questions, and he tipped exactly 20% calculated in his head, left in exact bills. Nora had worked his table for 3 years. They had exchanged perhaps 200 words total, She knew his order. He knew her name. That was the whole of it, and it suited them both fine. October arrived in Harlan the way it always did, stripping the hills down to bone colors red and gold, burning out to brown over 2 weeks, the mornings turning cold enough to see breath, the evenings settling into a dark that came earlier every day. The diner stayed warm, the coffee stayed hot. The regulars came in with their coats and their complaints about weather and their conversations that had been going on in one form or another since before Nora was born. Stuart Vance arrived on the first Tuesday of October. He came in at 11:15 after the last of the late-night crowd had thinned out when the diner was down to 2 booths and Floyd working quietly in the back. He was 38 years old, medium height, well-built, without being aggressive about it, with the kind of grooming that indicated money spent on maintenance rather than vanity. Pressed shirt, good watch, clean hands. He sat at a booth by the window and looked at the menu for approximately 45 seconds before setting it down. Nora brought it water and asked if he was ready. He ordered the county ham platter and a slice of apple pie and a coffee. He said please and thank you at the right times. He did not linger over the ordering. He did not use her name, which she noted, because some people read it off her name tag immediately and used it in the way that felt like a grip, but he did not. He simply ordered, thanked her, and looked out the window at the empty parking lot. He paid cash, left 15%. She did not think about him after he left. He came back Thursday, same booth, same order almost. He swapped the pie for peach cobbler and asked if they had oat milk, which they did not, and when she told him that, he smiled and said black coffee was fine. He told her the county ham was the best he had had since Georgia. She said Floyd had been making it the same way for 30 years. He said that was the kind of thing that mattered. She agreed and went to refill the coffee at table 4. He came back the following Tuesday and Thursday, the week after that as well. By the third week, Nora noticed he knew her name without reading the tag. It was a small thing. People learned names. Regulars did it all the time. Floyd knew every regular's name within 2 visits. Nora herself could recite the coffee orders of 40 people from memory. Knowing a name was not unusual, but Stuart Vance used it the way you use something you had acquired. Good evening, Nora. That is a long night you are working, Nora. Cold out there tonight, Nora. She mentioned it to Floyd during a slow stretch at 2 in the morning, leaning against the counter while he restocked the fry station. Floyd was 61, thick in the middle, with arms that had spent 40 years lifting industrial pots and cast iron pans in the general weight of other people's problems. He listened the way he always listened, with half his attention and all of his experience. He said Stuart Vance had just bought the old coal company land north of town. Said he was bringing in a resort development, cabins, hiking trails, a spa, whatever that meant, in eastern Kentucky. Said the county needed the bombs and the tax revenue, and that Dale Pruitt had been over there twice for dinner and come back smiling both times. Floyd said Nora was a beautiful girl, and some men were just charmed by that. He laid it out with the precision of a man who had already decided what the facts meant before she finished saying them. Nora did not push it. She went back to work. The following week, she found the first envelope. It was on her doorstep when she came home at 6:15 in the morning. A small envelope, cream-colored, unsealed, containing a single piece of notepaper folded once. On the paper was written in clean printed letters, "Saw you walking home this morning. Wanted you to know the neighborhood is safe. A friend." Her address was not listed anywhere. She paid cash for her room at Mrs. Aldridge's boarding house and used a P.O. box for everything that required a mailing address. She had been careful about that since she was 19, after her mother's boyfriend had shown up twice at places she had not told her mother she would be. She stood on the steps for a long moment with the envelope in both hands, reading the words again. Then she went inside, made coffee, and sat at her small kitchen table, trying to decide if this was something or nothing. She decided it was something. She went to Dale Pruitt's office the next afternoon before her shift. She brought the note in its envelope, held carefully by the edges. She told Dale the full sequence: the booth visits, the name, the note, her unlisted home address. Dale listened with the patient expression of a man hearing a complaint he had decided to categorize before it finished arriving. He told her Stuart Vance was a respected businessman conducting a $40 million development project in their county. He told her men admired pretty women, and some of them were clumsy about it. He told her the note said the neighborhood was safe, which was a polite thing to say. He told her if anything concrete happened, she was welcome to come back. She asked what he considered concrete. He looked at her in a way that was not quite dismissive, but close enough to make no practical difference, and said she would know it when it happened. She thanked him and left. That night, Stewart came in at 11:30. He sat in his usual booth. He ordered the usual. When she brought his coffee, he looked up at her and said, "I imagine you sleep well in this town." Quiet streets. She did not answer. She turned and walked back to the service station and stood with her back to the room for 3 breaths before she trusted her face to be neutral again. Floyd saw it. He did not say anything, but he started staying out front more that night, leaning on the counter near the register, talking to nobody in particular, just present. The following Monday, she found a small package on her fire escape, wrapped in brown paper tied with kitchen twine. Inside was a jar of local honey with a handwritten label from a farm she did not recognize, and beneath it a photograph. The photograph showed the exterior of Hollow Creek Diner at night, taken from the parking lot across the street, the lit windows bright against the dark, and through the glass, barely visible but unmistakable, the back of a woman with red-brown hair in a braid moving between tables. She had been photographed through the diner window, at work, without knowing it. Her hands did not shake when she looked at the photograph. She had learned young how to keep her hands steady when her chest was not. She set the photograph down on her kitchen table next to the honey and the brown paper and looked at them for a long time. Then she called Dale Pruitt. Dale came by at 2 in the afternoon off hours in his personal truck, which told her immediately how seriously he was taking this. He looked at the photograph. He looked at the honey jar. He asked if the photo could have been taken by anyone else, if she had any other concerns with anyone, if there was an ex or a former regular, or anyone who might have a grievance. She said no to each question. She said Stuart Vance visited the diner 4 nights a week, knew her name without being told, had found her unlisted home address, and had now photographed her at work without her knowledge. Dale said he would have a word with Stuart. She asked what kind of word. He said an informal one. He said Stuart was an important man at a sensitive moment for the county, and that these things could sometimes be misunderstandings that an informal conversation could clear up without paperwork and complications. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "All right, Dale." She said it the way a person said something they had already decided meant nothing and were only saying to be done with the conversation. She went home. She did not sleep well. She lay in the narrow bed in her room at Mrs. Aldridge's boarding house and looked at the ceiling and thought about her father. Thomas Calloway had died when Nora was 12. A highway accident outside of Corbin, his truck sliding on black ice at 5 in the morning on the way to an early job. He had been a careful man, her father, careful and quiet, and entirely convinced that other people would be decent if you gave them enough room. Nora had inherited his caution and none of his optimism, which she considered one of the great acts of mercy in her life. After he died, her mother had come apart slowly, the way old wood came apart in water. Not all at once, but piece by piece, until there was nothing structurally left. By the time Nora was 15, there was more bottle in the house than anything else. And by 17, she had packed what she owned into one bag and walked out without a note, because she had learned by then that some conversations only kept you from leaving. She had been taking care of herself for 7 years. She knew how to read a room. She knew how to read a person. And she had read Stuart Vance clearly enough that she had no interest in waiting for Dale Pruitt's informal word to produce results. She started keeping records. She bought a small notebook from the pharmacy on 3rd Street. In it, she wrote dates, times booth numbers, exact words when she could remember them. She noted when his truck was in the parking lot before she clocked in. She noted when it was still there after she clocked out. She noted the angle of the photograph and calculated where it must have been taken from based on the diner's window positions and the height of the subject. She took the notebook to Loretta Finch. Loretta sat at the diner counter every weekday morning at 7, a ritual she had maintained through 3 presidential administrations and 2 knee surgeries. She was 68 years old, small and sharp with white hair and reading glasses on a chain, in the economy of movement of a woman who had spent 30 years in a courthouse deciding what mattered and what was noise. She had been the county clerk for 3 decades. She had seen every document filed in Harlan County and a great many that should have been filed and were not. She had worked alongside Dale Pruitt when he was a deputy. She liked him the way you liked a reliable but unimaginative tool. She trusted him the way you trusted the same tool to operate only within its rated capacity. Nora set the notebook on the counter beside Loretta's coffee and told her the whole thing from the beginning. Loretta read the notebook without interrupting. When she was done, she set it down and looked at Nora over her reading glasses for a moment. She said, "Is this everything?" Nora said yes. Loretta said, "And Dale has had this information." Nora said, "Mostly." Dale had seen the note and the photograph. Loretta said, "I am going to look into something." She did not say what. She did not ask permission. She picked up her coffee, finished it, and set the exact amount of the bill plus 20% on the counter in neat bills and left. 3 days passed. Nora worked her shifts. Stuart came in Tuesday and Wednesday that week instead of his usual pattern, which was itself a kind of message, a reminder that his schedule was flexible and hers was fixed. He did not say anything inappropriate. He did not need to. His presence was the statement. On Friday morning, Loretta came back to the diner early. She sat at the counter and waited until Floyd went to the back, and then she laid a single piece of paper face down on the counter and pushed it toward Nora. Nora turned it over. It was a printout, faded header from a Georgia County court, a civil protection order issued in 2015 against one Stuart Raymond Vance, age 33 at the time. The respondent had been prohibited from contacting, following, photographing, or coming within 500 feet of one female employee of a restaurant in Chatham County, Georgia. The order had been issued, then vacated 6 months later following a civil settlement. The settlement terms were sealed. Nora read the document twice. The woman's name was not there, sealed. The amount was not there, sealed. But the pattern was there, clear as anything Nora had written in her own notebook just 5 years earlier and 400 miles south. She looked up at Loretta. Loretta said, "He has done this before." Nora said, "And nobody stopped him." Loretta said, "Someone paid for it to be quiet." She paused. "He is a very good investor and a very patient man, which means he has done the math on what silence costs and what it is worth." Nora looked at the printout, then she turned it back over on the counter. She said, "What do I do with this?" Loretta said, "Right now you keep working and you keep writing in that notebook." She said, "I made a copy." She said, "Dale will not act until he has no other choice." She said, "We are going to give him no other choice, but we need to do this right or it disappears into a settlement like the last one." Nora nodded. She folded the printout and put it inside the back cover of the notebook. That night at 11:50, Stuart Vance walked into the diner and sat in his booth and looked at her in a way that she could not have described to a jury, but understood completely the way an animal understood the stillness of another animal that had decided to be patient. She brought his coffee. She did not let her hands show anything. She went back to the service station and she wrote down 11:50, booth 4, same order, eye contact, held 8 seconds, did not look away first. It was a Tuesday. It would not be the worst night of the month. That came 3 weeks later on a night with no moon and a wind that came down out of the hills and made the diner sign rattle in its housing. She had clocked out at 6 and started walking. She always walked the same 2 blocks to Mrs. Aldridge's because it was a small town and there was no other reasonable route, and because part of her had refused to change her path based on the behavior of someone who had no right to ask her to change anything. She heard the car before she saw it. Not Stuart's truck, something darker. It rolled slowly along the opposite side of the street, pacing her without urgency, the headlights off. She kept walking. She did not speed up. She turned right on Locust instead of going straight, adding 2 blocks to the route testing. The car turned right on Locust. She turned left on Mill. The car did not follow immediately. Then it appeared again at the far end of Mill, already ahead of her. Somehow already waiting headlights, still dark engine, a low murmur in the gray morning. She stopped walking. There was a space between 2 buildings to her left, a shortcut she had used before, in better circumstances, a narrow passage between the hardware store and the old savings building that opened into the alley behind 3rd Street. She took it at a walk, then a jog, then a flat run when she heard the car door open behind her. She did not scream. Screaming was noise, and noise took breath, and she needed her breath for running. She came out of the passage onto 3rd Street and turned north without thinking, because north was where the lights were, and the lights were at Iron Shepherd Garage, the last building on 3rd, before the road bent into the dark. The bay doors were half open, orange light spilling across the gravel. She could hear the faint sound of metal on metal. Someone was working. She hit the side door with both palms, and it swung open, and she nearly fell through it and caught herself on the doorframe and stood there breathing in the warm, oil-smelling air. Decker Holt was at the far bench standing over an engine block with a torque wrench in his hand. He looked up at the sound of the door. He looked at her for 1 second. He took in the breath, the face, the shaking hands, the morning coat with the collar turned up wrong from running. He set the torque wrench down on the bench with a careful, deliberate movement. He said, "Close the door behind you." His voice was the same as it was at the diner counter level, and unhurried, giving her nothing to flinch from. She closed the door. He said, "Are you hurt?" She said, "No." He said, "Is someone outside?" She said she did not know. She said she thought so. She said the car had followed her from the diner and she had cut through the hardware store alley. He crossed the garage in 8 steps and went out the side door without telling her to wait. She heard his boots on the gravel. She heard nothing from outside. He came back 90 seconds later and pulled the side door closed and shot the bolt. He said, "Dark sedan, no plates, parked on Mill Street. Gone now." She let out a breath she had been holding since Locust Avenue. He said, "Come sit down." There were 2 folding chairs near the parts wall. He pointed at one without making it an order. She sat. He went to the corner where a battered coffee maker sat on a shelf beside a stack of paper cups and poured one without asking and held it out to her. She took it. He sat in the second chair and did not look up from the floor immediately, the way men who were thinking sometimes looked at floors while they arranged what they knew. He said, "That is not the first time." She said, "No." He said, "Have you talked to Dale?" She said, "Twice." He said, "And?" She said, "He thinks Stuart Vance is important to the county." There was a pause. Outside, the wind moved through the gravel lot. Somewhere in the back of the garage, another door rattled in its frame. Decker said, "Tell me from the beginning." She looked at him. This was the man who sat at the far end of her counter twice a week and read his paperwork and never asked her anything except whether the cobbler was made in-house. This was the man whose jacket patch had made at least 3 of her regular customers lower their voices when he walked in. She had worked 3 feet from him for 3 years, and they had exchanged enough words to fill one side of a note card. She told him from the beginning, anyway. She told him about October, and the booth, and the name, and the unlisted address, and the photograph through the window. She told him about the notebook. She told him about Dale's 2 responses and what Loretta had found in Georgia. She told him about the car tonight in the alley and the way she had run north because it was the only light she could see. He did not look up from his coffee while she spoke. His hands stayed flat on his knees. When she finished, he was quiet long enough that she wondered if he had heard. Then he reached into his jacket and came out with a phone and dialed without explanation. He made 2 calls. The first was to Dale Pruitt's overnight line, leaving a message with the specific details about the dark sedan on Mill Street, the time, the direction of departure, his own name and address. The second call she could not hear fully because he stepped half behind the bench, but she caught enough. He said, "Nora Calloway." He said, "3rd Street." He said, "No, she is here, and she is all right." He came back and sat down. He said, "2 of my people will be here in 20 minutes. We will get you home safely, and someone will be outside your building until morning." She looked at him. She said, "Why?" It was not a rude question. It was a genuine one. She had grown up understanding that most help had a cost, that nothing was given without something being taken, and that men who offered protection without a stated price were the ones you needed to understand most carefully. Decker seemed to understand the question for what it was. He said, "Because you ran to the right place, and I am not going to make that the wrong decision." She held the paper cup with both hands. Outside, the wind came down off the ridge and moved through the gravel and made the building creak along its joints. She said, "I have a notebook and a Georgia document, and nobody who will move on any of it until something worse happens." He said, "Then we make sure something worse does not happen while we work on the something else." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked down at the paper cup. She said, "I do not want this to turn into something violent." He said, "Neither do I." She said, "I mean it." He said, "So do I." And she believed him, not because he was large or because he sat in a garage full of men with road patches on their backs, but because he had set down the torque wrench carefully before he crossed the room, and careful was a language she had been reading her whole life. 20 minutes later, 2 Iron Shepherd members arrived in a pickup, said nothing to Nora except "Good morning," walked her the 4 blocks to Mrs. Aldridge's, checked the exterior of the building, and posted in the truck across the street until she turned her light off. She did not sleep immediately. She lay in the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about the notebook in her bag and Loretta's Georgia printout and the way Decker Holt had said "good" the way you said "good" When someone told you they had been doing the one correct thing without knowing it was the thing that would eventually matter. She thought about her father, careful and quiet and dead at 39 on a black ice morning. She thought, I am still here. Outside, a truck engine idled softly in the dark, patient and steady like something that had learned to wait for the right moment. She did not know yet that someone would soon be sitting on her front steps in the cold to say the words that would change the weight of everything. She did not know her story was not hers alone. She did not know that somewhere in Pikeville, a woman named Deanna Pruitt had heard one sentence through a chain of cousins and hardware store conversations and had started thinking about the 2-hour drive to Harlan. The town slept around her, ordinary and unknowing, while Stuart Vance went wherever men like Stuart Vance went when they ran out of road for the night. Tomorrow she would get up and tie her braid and put on her work shoes and go back to the diner. She would bring his coffee. She would keep her face steady, and she would write it all down. The next morning came gray and cold, the kind of cold that arrived in Harlan in November like a debt coming due. Nora woke at noon later than usual and lay still for a moment, listening to the sounds of the boarding house. Mrs. Aldridge moving pots in the downstairs kitchen, a radio playing gospel somewhere. The truck from Iron Shepherd was gone from across the street. She had watched it leave at 7:15 through the gap in her curtain. She got up, made coffee on her small electric burner, and opened her notebook to a fresh page. At the top, she wrote the date. Below that, she wrote Dark Sedan Mill Street, approximately 6:05 a.m. No plates visible. Fled east when Decker Holt exited garage. Vehicle description: 4-door black or dark navy domestic make. Approximate year 2015 to 2018. Then she added Decker Holt Iron Shepherd garage witness departure. Can corroborate. She added that line twice, then underlined it once. She ate toast and thought about what Loretta had said about doing things right. The Georgia case had disappeared into a sealed settlement, which meant money had outrun consequence. Stuart Vance was not a man who made mistakes. He was a man who budgeted for them. That was different, and it required a different kind of response. She went to the diner at 3 to pick up her schedule for the following week. Floyd was prepping the grill when she came in. He looked up with the particular expression he wore when he was worried about something but had decided not to lead with it. He said, Dale came by this morning. She said, what did he say? Floyd said he said there was a call last night from Iron Shepherd about a car on Mill Street. He said he wanted to know if you had filed a formal complaint. She said, I filed one 3 weeks ago. Floyd said he could not find the record of it. She stood at the register and let that settle. Dale Pruitt had lost her complaint, or had not filed it, or had filed it somewhere that was not the system he would have to acknowledge later. She did not know which one it was, and it almost did not matter. The result was the same. She said, I kept a copy. Floyd nodded. Good, he said. Then quieter, he said, Stuart called the owner this morning. Said he was concerned about an incident at the diner involving staff, and that he hoped everything was handled professionally. Nora looked at him. Floyd said the owner told him everything here was professional. Floyd said, I told the owner to stay out of my kitchen and let me run my staff, which I have been doing since before the owner had his driver's license. She said, Floyd. He said, do not thank me. I'm just telling you so you know the shape of it. The shape of it was clear enough. Stuart Vance had money and property development and the goodwill of Dale Pruitt, and now had made a call to the diner's owner. He was building a frame around her, a quiet frame that turned her into the problem before she could turn him into one. She worked her shift that night. He did not come in, which she wrote down along with the time and the absence. She had learned from Loretta that absences were sometimes data. He came in the following night, Wednesday, off his pattern again. He sat in the booth, ordered his food, and when she brought the coffee, he looked up and said, I hear there was some excitement last night near 3rd Street. She said, I would not know. He said, Harlan is a small town. Word travels. She said, will you be having pie tonight? He said, no thank you, Nora. I think I have had enough sweetness for one evening. She wrote that down verbatim in the notebook in the supply closet at 11:47. She wrote the exact words in the time, in the tone, which she described as leisurely performed, aware that it would be hard to explain to someone who was not there to hear it. Decker came in Thursday morning at 5:45, same as always. He sat at the far end of the counter. She brought his coffee without being asked. He looked at it for a moment, then looked up at her. He said, how are you doing? She said, I am doing what I always do. He said, that is not what I asked. She refilled the cup at table 3, came back and stood behind the counter. She said Stewart came in last night. She said he mentioned the incident on Mill Street. She said Dale has no record of the complaint I filed. Decker looked at his coffee. He said, I have the voicemail I left Dale's overnight line. Time-stamped. She said he will say it was informal. Decker said, then we make it formal. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and put a business card on the counter. It was not his own card. It had the name of a woman, Ellen Marsh, with an address in Lexington, and the words Victim Advocacy and Legal Services below. He said she works with the State Domestic Violence Coalition. She handles stalking cases. She does not need the police to have filed a report before she can open a file. She needs a documented pattern and a willing complainant. Nora looked at the card. She said, I do not consider myself a victim. He said, I know you do not. He said she does not use that word the way it sounds when you say it. He said she uses it the way a mechanic uses a diagnosis. Just a description of a condition so you know what you are working on. Nora turned the card over. The back was blank. She put it in her apron pocket. She called Ellen Marsh that afternoon. Ellen answered on the second ring, spoke without preamble, and asked Nora to tell her everything in the order it happened. Nora read from the notebook. Ellen listened and occasionally asked for clarifications of specific times and dates. At the end, she said this is a documented pattern consistent with predatory stalking. She said the Georgia record is significant. She said, I am going to help you build a case that does not depend on Dale Pruitt. Nora said, I am not sure I can afford a lawyer. Ellen said, I am not a lawyer. I am an advocate, and this is what I do. Nora sat with that for a moment. Then she said, all right. She went to the diner that night and she worked her shift and she brought Stewart his coffee and she did not let her face show a single thing that was true. 2 weeks passed. Ellen had Nora documenting everything with new precision, time-stamped photos of the diner exterior, screenshots of the diner parking lot camera, which the owner reluctantly agreed to preserve after Ellen sent a formal preservation request on Nora's behalf. Floyd provided a written statement about the pattern of visits. Mrs. Aldridge confirmed the envelope on the doorstep and the fire escape delivery and provided her own written account. The notebook had 21 days of entries. The Georgia document was in Ellen's file. The parking lot camera had Stewart's vehicle on 9 separate nights. It was beginning to look like something that could not be quietly settled. That was when the town began to notice. Not everyone and not all at once, but the way small towns notice things through a conversation at the pharmacy counter and a comment at the school board meeting and a word between 2 farmers at the feed store. Someone had heard that Nora Calloway had filed something about Stewart Vance. Someone else had heard that Dale Pruitt was handling it quietly. A third person had heard the word quietly and understood what it meant. The county needed Stewart Vance's $40 million project. That was the mathematics everyone ran in their heads without saying out loud. 400 jobs, new roads, a hotel that would bring in taxes for the next 30 years. That was what was on one side of the scale. On the other side was a 24-year-old waitress with a notebook and a stubborn face. Nora heard the town talking because small towns talked, and she worked the shift when tired people said things they forgot they had said. She heard it without bitterness mostly. She understood scarcity and the decisions it produced. She had been making them her whole life. But 2 things happened in the 3rd week of November that changed the weight of the scale. The first was a phone call to Decker Holt. He told her about it the next Thursday morning, flat and direct the way he told things. A man named Charles Whitfield, who sat on the county development board and who had golfed with Stewart twice in the past month, had called Decker and suggested that Iron Shepherd's annual charity ride permit might encounter some review delays if the club continued to involve itself in what Whitfield called a private employment dispute. Decker said I told him the permit was a county matter and he was welcome to call the county clerk. Nora said Loretta. Decker said yes. She almost smiled. The second thing was a note under the door of her room at Mrs. Aldridge's, not from Stewart this time, from someone else. A single line on a torn piece of notebook paper handwriting she did not recognize. It said, there was one before you in Harlan. Her name was Dee. She did not stay. Nora sat on her bed and read the note 4 times. She showed it to Loretta the next morning. Loretta turned it over in her hands. She said, I do not know a Dee who left town under circumstances. She said, but I have been here 30 years, and there are things that happen quietly that do not enter any record. She said, I will ask around carefully. She also did. This note means someone in this town knows more than they have been willing to say. She said that is not nothing. She said sometimes people just need to know someone is actually fighting before they will add their weight to it. Nora took the note to Ellen. Ellen scanned it and added it to the file and said, if there is another victim in this county, documented or not, that changes the scope of what we can present significantly. Nora went back to work. That Friday night, she was alone in the diner at 2 in the morning, Floyd in the back. One booth occupied by a couple of truckers who would be gone in 20 minutes when Stuart Vance came through the door. He did not sit at his booth. He came to the counter. He sat down 3 stools from the register, which put him between her and the door in a way that was not accidental, that placed the register as an obstacle between her body and the exit. She recognized it the way you recognized a chess move, not because she had played chess, but because she had spent her whole life learning the geometry of rooms and the people in them. She did not move from behind the counter. She said, "Good evening." She put her hand on the counter near the register where the phone was. He said, "I have been thinking about a conversation we should have." She said, "We are not going to have that conversation." He said, "I think you have misread some things. I think you are a smart woman, but you have been talking to people who have filled your head with an interpretation of events that is not accurate." He said it calmly, pleasantly, in the voice of a man explaining a clerical error. She said, "I will be right back," and she turned and walked to the service window and said Floyd's name. Floyd came out immediately. He did not ask why. He stood next to Morrow behind the counter and looked at Stewart with the expression of a man who had been waiting for an excuse to use it. Stewart looked at Floyd. Then he looked at Nora. Something behind his eyes calculated. He said, "You have good people around you, Nora." She said, "I know." He said, "That makes things more complicated." Floyd said, "Can I get you anything?" Stewart said, "No, thank you. I was just leaving." He stood, adjusted his jacket, and walked to the door with the unhurried ease of a man who had decided to leave on his own terms. At the door, he stopped and looked back. He said, "I hope we can resolve this like adults." Floyd said, "The door is right there, friend." Stewart left. Nora wrote it down at 2:16 a.m. verbatim, including Floyd's line because it was the best sentence Floyd had ever said, and she wanted it on record. The next morning, she called Ellen Marsh. She told her what had happened. Ellen said that an in-person contact at her workplace after the documented pattern was established and after a formal complaint was on file could constitute a significant escalation. She said, "I am going to request an emergency consultation with the State Victim Services Office." She said, "Is there any chance that diner has camera coverage of the counter?" Nora said there was. The owner had installed a single camera above the register 18 months ago after a register discrepancy. She knew exactly what angle it covered because she had stood behind that counter for 7 years. Stuart Vance had sat directly in its field of view. Ellen said, "I need that footage preserved today." Nora called the owner at 9 in the morning and explained that a legal advocate in Lexington needed the footage preserved for a formal complaint. The owner said he needed to speak with his attorney. Nora said that was his right and that Ellen Marsh's office would be sending a formal preservation request within the hour regardless. By noon, the request had gone out. By 2 in the afternoon, the owner had called Floyd to ask what was happening. Floyd said, "A man has been coming in and frightening my waitress, and now the law is involved." He said, "I suggest you cooperate completely and let me run my kitchen." Nora heard this account from Floyd over the supply closet phone and had to press her hand over her mouth to keep from making a noise that would have carried through the wall. That evening, Decker came by the diner 2 hours before his usual time. He sat at the counter and ordered coffee and said nothing unusual. But she noticed that he did not bring any paperwork. He simply sat and drank coffee and read a magazine someone had left on the stool beside him. He was there when Stewart did not come in. He was there when the truckers left and the diner quieted. He was there at midnight when Nora's hands were tired from the counter and her feet ached in her work shoes. At 1 in the morning, she refilled his cup and said, "You have been here 3 hours." He said, "Good coffee." She said, "It is the same coffee as always." He said, "Then I have always had good taste and never mentioned it." She looked at him. He was looking at the magazine, turning a page he had probably already read. She said, "You do not have to do this." He set the magazine down. He looked at her for a moment, not quickly the way he looked at things he was taking in fully. He said, "Do you know why I bought this garage?" She said no. He said, "I bought it because when I came back from the Gulf, I needed something to do with my hands that was not destroying things." He said, "Engines are broken and you fix them. You put the right part in the right place with the right amount of force, and you do not guess and you do not rush, and it works. He said most things that are wrong with the world are wrong because someone skipped a step or used too much force or did not look at the whole system before they started pulling things apart. He picked up his coffee. He said you have been doing the right steps the whole time. He said, I am not here to fix anything. I am just here so you are not doing the steps alone. She stood behind the counter for a moment. The diner hummed around them, the coffee maker, the cold case, the fluorescent light that buzzed slightly above the pie shelf. She said, that is the most words I have ever heard you say at one time. He said, do not get used to it. She laughed. It came out the way Floyd had described it, larger than expected, and it filled the empty diner. And Decker did not smile exactly, but something in his face changed the way an engine changed when the last bolt was tightened correctly and the whole thing settled into alignment. She worked until 6. He left at 3, and by the time she clocked out, there was an Iron Shepherd truck parked across the lot. She walked home in the cold with the notebook under her arm and Stuart Vance's words still sitting in the back of her throat. I hope we can resolve this like adults. She thought I am the most adult person in this entire situation. I have been adult since I was 17, and I have never once asked anyone to absorb a consequence I was not willing to absorb myself. She turned onto Mrs. Aldridge's street and stopped. Outside her building, sitting on the front step in a heavy coat, was a woman she had never seen before. Late 30s, dark circles under her eyes, a diner apron folded in her lap as if she had come straight from a shift somewhere. The woman had been sitting long enough in the cold that her breath had left a thin frost on the lapel of her coat. The woman looked up. She said, "Are you Nora Calloway?" Nora said yes. The woman said, "My name is Deanna Pruitt. People call me Dee." She said, "I worked at the Route 9 diner in Harlan 4 years ago." She said, "I left because of Stuart Vance." Nora stood on the cold sidewalk and looked at her. She said, "Come inside." Deanna Pruitt had a face that had been pretty once and still was in the way that certain things remained beautiful after they had been through weather. 37 years old, dark hair going early silver at the temples, hands that were steady, even though the rest of her had not been for some time. She sat across from Nora at the small kitchen table in Mrs. Aldridge's boarding house and drank the tea Nora made because it was the only thing in the cabinet, and talked for 90 minutes without stopping, the way people talked when they had been holding something for 4 years and finally found a room that felt safe enough to put it down. Stuart Vance had been different then. Newer to the area in Harlan only for an early phase of what turned out to be a failed development project that preceded his current one. He had come into the Route 9 diner for 3 months, and what he had done to Dee was the same as what he was doing to Nora, in the same order with the same patience. The booth, the name, the address, the gifts, the photograph, the conversations that were polite enough that she could not explain why she was afraid without sounding irrational. But Dee had not had a Loretta. She had not had a notebook. She had been 23 and alone, and when she told the manager, a man named Greer who owed Stuart a construction favor, she had been moved to the lunch shift to reduce contact. When she told the police, she had been told Stuart was a businessman and she was sensitive. When she told her landlord that someone had been inside her apartment, she was given 30 days notice for unspecified lease violations. She had left Harlan. She had gone to her sister in Pikeville and spent 2 years being afraid of diners and men in good jackets, in the particular way some people smiled when they wanted you to feel observed. She had heard about Nora through a cousin who worked at the hardware store, who had heard something from Floyd Briggs, who had said exactly one sentence that carried through the town and eventually reached Dee in Pikeville. He said, "A girl is fighting back and she is not leaving." Dee had driven 2 hours to sit on a cold stoop and say what she had never been asked to say clearly to someone who would write it down. Nora wrote it all down. In the morning, she called Ellen Marsh. She said, "I have a prior victim who is willing to give a full statement." She said she was in this county 4 years ago. Same subject, same pattern. Ellen was silent for 3 seconds, which Nora had come to understand was her version of a significant reaction. Then she said, "Nora, this changes the classification of the case." She said, "One incident is a dispute. 2 incidents in the same county with the same documented pattern of behavior is predatory conduct with escalation." She said, "I am calling the State Attorney General's Victim Services Division today." She called. The state office called back within 4 hours, which Nora later learned was unusual. Ellen said the Georgia case and the Harlan prior together make a three-jurisdiction pattern. That level of documentation is enough for a federal stalking inquiry under the Violence Against Women Act, which removes Dale Pruitt from the chain of authority entirely. Nora sat with that for a long moment. She said he is going to find out. Ellen said yes. Probably before we want him to. She was right. By that evening, Stuart Vance knew something had shifted. Nora could tell because he did not come in that night and because Charles Whitfield called Decker Holt again this time, not about permits, but to say that certain parties were prepared to offer a significant financial settlement to any parties involved in current disputes, if matters could be resolved quietly before the end of the fiscal quarter. Decker called Nora and repeated this verbatim. She said, "What did you say to him?" Decker said, "I told him I was a mechanic and he had the wrong number." Nora said, "I want to say no." Decker said, "Then say no." She said Dee did not get to say no. Neither did the woman in Georgia. Decker said, "That is why it matters that you do." She called Ellen and said no. Ellen called the state office and confirmed no. The state office called the county prosecutor's office in Harlan, not Dale Pruitt, the county prosecutor who had been elected independent of Dale and who had a considerably lower tolerance for phone calls from development lawyers. Her name was Margot Slade, 44 years old, 12 years in the prosecutor's office, the kind of woman who read documents with a red pen and kept a precise running file of cases that should have been prosecuted and were not. Margot Slade read the file on a Friday afternoon and called Ellen by 4 o'clock. She said, "I have Dale's 2 incident reports. Or rather, I have 2 incident numbers with no attached documentation." She said that is itself a record-keeping problem I plan to address separately. She said, "I also have the Georgia court record, the Harlan prior from Ms. Pruitt, and a 9-night vehicle log from preserved security footage showing a pattern of surveillance." She said, "I have enough to request an arrest warrant by Monday." Nora heard this from Ellen on Friday evening, standing in her coat in the boarding house hallway, and she had to put one hand on the wall because her knees made a brief argument about whether to continue functioning. Then she straightened up and went to work. She worked her shift that night with the same efficiency she had always worked at, moving between tables, keeping coffee hot, keeping her face the professional blank she had built over 7 years. Stuart came in at 11:30 later than usual, and he did not order food. He ordered coffee and sat with it and watched her the way he had always watched her. And for one moment when she brought the check without being asked, he looked up at her and said, "I thought you were smarter than this, Nora." She looked at him. She thought of Dee driving 2 hours in the cold. She thought of the sealed Georgia settlement and the woman whose name she still did not know. She thought of her notebook, 27 days of entries, every line written in the steady hand her father had given her. She said, "I am exactly as smart as this." She put the check on the table and walked away. He left. She did not watch him go. Floyd came out of the back and stood at the service window, and she could feel him watching her. She said, "I am fine." He said, "I know you are." He said it the same way he had said she had the best instincts of anyone he had ever worked with. Once plainly and meant to last. On Monday morning, Margot Slade filed for the warrant. It was granted by a circuit court judge in Lexington who had been briefed by the state office and who signed it without the local political considerations that had been insulating Stuart Vance from consequence for 4 years. 2 county detectives from the State Criminal Investigation Division arrived in Harlan on Monday afternoon. They did not involve Dale Pruitt in the operation. They served the warrant at Stuart Vance's development office at the north end of town at 2:15 in the afternoon while Stuart was in a meeting with 2 contractors. He was arrested for stalking under the federal statute, which carried the prior pattern in Georgia as aggravating documentation, and for criminal intimidation relating to the employment contact at Hollow Creek Diner. He walked out of his building in handcuffs in the middle of the afternoon on a Monday, while the town of Harlan went about its ordinary business. And what was extraordinary was how ordinary the moment looked. 2 detectives, 1 lawyer already on the phone, 1 man who had budgeted carefully for silence, discovering that silence had a ceiling he had never tested until now. The development board convened an emergency session Tuesday morning. The $40 million project was not legally affected by Stuart's arrest, which meant the county still had its investment. That took the weight off the scale that had been pressing against Nora for 2 months, and without that weight, the room had a different character entirely. Dale Pruitt announced he would be stepping down at the end of the month, citing personal reasons. No one in town was surprised. Several people were relieved. Loretta Finch filed the required documentation for a special election that would be conducted in February, moving through the process with the quiet precision of someone who had been waiting a long time to use a procedure she had memorized in advance. The owner of Hollow Creek Diner called Nora on Tuesday afternoon and said he was sorry for what she had been through. She accepted the apology without ceremony because it was genuine and because she was tired and because some things were better received simply and then set down. Floyd said, if he does anything to your hours or your position, I am filing my own set of paperwork. She said he is not going to do that. Floyd said, I know he is not because he knows I will. She laughed. He did too, which was rare enough that she took a mental note of it. Dee Pruitt gave her formal statement to Margot Slade's office on Wednesday. The Georgia woman whose name the sealed settlement had protected for 4 years was contacted by the state office and chose to speak. Her name was Carrie Whitmore. She was now 31, living in Savannah, and she had been waiting for a phone call she had decided would probably never come. When it came, she said, I thought I was the only one. Nora heard this secondhand from Ellen and thought about it for a long time after. 3 women in 3 places had lived inside the same story at different points, each one alone. Each one told she was misreading things. Each one given an explanation for why the man doing this was more important than the thing he was doing. 3 women who had been told to manage it quietly, absorb it professionally, not make complications. Nora had been the one who wrote it down and refused to leave. She did not consider herself brave in the way people use the word when they meant exceptional. She considered herself someone who had run out of space to go and had stopped running and turned around. The courage, if it was, that was not dramatic. It was just the daily decision to keep the notebook and make the calls and stand behind the counter with a neutral face and not accept the money when it was offered. Ellen called her on Thursday and said the state attorney general's office wanted to use the case as a training model for county-level stalking response, specifically the documentation protocol and the multi-jurisdiction coordination. She said they want to know if you would be willing to speak to county victim services liaisons at a conference in Frankfurt in the spring. Nora said, I am a waitress. Ellen said, you are also the most organized stalking victim documentation I have seen in 12 years of this work. Nora said she would think about it. She did think about it. She thought about it all the way through her Thursday night shift, pulling coffee and keeping plates warm and watching the door and knowing that the person she was watching for was no longer going to walk through it. That was a different kind of quiet than the ordinary quiet of 2 in the morning. It was lighter. Decker came in Friday morning. He sat at the far end of the counter. She brought his coffee before he asked. He looked at it, then up at her. He said, I heard Slade filed on Monday. She said, yes. He said, I heard it went well. She said, it is going to take a while to get through the courts, but yes, he said, and how are you? She thought about it. She said, I am tired. I am relieved. I am worried about Dee and about Carrie Whitmore in Georgia, who I will probably never meet. I am thinking about whether to go to Frankfurt in the spring. I am going to need a different pair of work shoes by December because these ones are done. He said, we have a boot supplier at the garage who gives a trade discount. She said, that is unexpectedly practical. He said, I am an unexpectedly practical person. She looked at him. 7 years of 5:45, Tuesdays and Thursdays, 200 words before this month. She said, why did you hire Ellen Marsh? He said, I did not hire her. I knew about her because 3 years ago, one of my members had a situation with a former employer who was making his life difficult. She helped. I kept the card. She said, and you gave it to me because... He said, because you came in my door at 6 in the morning with a shaking hands and a notebook you had already been keeping for 3 weeks, and that told me you were the kind of person who knew what to do but needed someone else to believe it was worth doing. She stood behind the counter with the coffee in her hand. She said, you were right. He said, I usually am. He said it without vanity, as a plain statement of fact, the way he stated everything. She said, that is the most arrogant thing you have ever said to me. He said, it is the most honest. She laughed again. The diner was empty except for them and the sound of Floyd in the back, running water, and the cold November morning pressing against the windows. In the weeks that followed, Harlan rearranged itself around the fact of what had happened the way towns always did, slowly and incompletely, and with occasional resistance from corners that preferred the previous arrangement. The development project moved forward under new oversight from the board. The Route 9 diner where Dee had worked put a safety sticker in its window without anyone asking them to. The pharmacy on 3rd Street did the same. the library, the hardware store after a brief internal discussion. Loretta Finch drafted a county protocol for stalking complaints that required supervisory sign-off from the prosecutor's office, rather than sole discretion of the responding officer. It was adopted by the county commission in December with less argument than anyone expected, possibly because the argument they would have had to make in public was one nobody wanted to be heard making. Iron Shepherd continued their irregular charity ride in October. 43 bikes on a Saturday morning, lining up at the edge of town, the way they did every year, raising money for the Children's Hospital, the way they always had. This year, before they left, Decker stopped the column in front of Hollow Creek Diner. Not for long, the riders did not get off their bikes. They did not make a speech or a ceremony. They simply stopped in a line along the street, engines idling, and Nora came to the diner door in her apron and stood in the morning light, and Decker Holt at the front of the column looked at her for a moment. Then he lifted one hand. The column moved. Floyd stood beside her watching them go. He said 43, he counted. She said, I know. He said, you all right. She looked at the empty street, still holding the warmth of 43 engines. She said, I am sure. She went inside and tied her apron tighter and picked up the coffee pot and went to work. Deanna Pruitt took a job at the County Victim Services Office in January, doing intake paperwork 3 days a week. She said it was the first time in 4 years she had felt useful rather than careful. She called Nora on the first day and said, I wanted you to know I started. Nora said, I am glad. Dee said, I still think about leaving sometimes, about how close I came to just staying gone. Nora said, I know. Dee said, do you ever think about what would have happened if you had just taken the settlement? Nora looked at the counter, at the coffee maker, at the window where the safety sticker now lived in the corner of the glass, small and bright, and exactly where children and tired adults could see it. She said, I think about it sometimes. She said, I think I would have spent the rest of my life wondering who came after me. Dee did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, thank you for not leaving. Nora said, thank you for coming back. She hung up and went to refill table 2 and table 4 and to check on Floyd, who was burning something in the back because he always burned something when he was thinking. And outside the window, Harlan looked the same as it always had, hills and frost and gray November sky and a stoplight blinking amber at the empty intersection. But some things had changed in it that would not change back. Carrie Whitmore in Savannah received a letter in December from the State Attorney General's office informing her that her case was being reviewed for potential reopening under the new multi-jurisdiction finding. She sat with the letter for 3 days before calling the number on it. When she did, the woman who answered said her name and said, take as much time as you need. Stuart Vance's trial was set for the following spring. His lawyers were good and the proceedings were long and complicated in the way that proceedings became when money was thorough. But the documentation was thorough too, because Nora Calloway had kept a notebook, and because Dee Pruitt had driven 2 hours in the cold, and because Loretta Finch had kept a copy, and because Decker Holt had set down a torque wrench carefully before crossing a room. Nora went to Frankfurt in March. She stood in front of 42 county victim services liaisons in a conference room with fluorescent lights and folding chairs and a podium that was slightly too tall for her, and she talked about documentation. She talked about time-stamped entries and preservation requests and the way a pattern became visible when someone was willing to write down every instance, including the ones that seemed too small to matter. She brought the notebook. She did not read from it. She just set it on the podium and let people see that it was a regular notebook from a pharmacy worn at the edges, filled with ordinary handwriting. She said, I am a waitress in Harlan, Kentucky. I am 24 years old. I do not have a law degree. I have this notebook and the decision to keep writing in it when everything around me was saying it was not worth it. She said it was worth it. She said it is always worth it. The room was quiet in a way that was different from ordinary quiet. On the drive back to Harlan, she stopped at a gas station outside of Berea and bought a new notebook from the rack near the register. Not because she needed one. She had 4 unused at home. But because it felt like the right thing to do to hold one in her hands that was still empty and full of possibility, all those blank pages waiting for whatever came next. She drove back through the hills in the late afternoon light, the sky going gold over the ridges, and when she came down into the valley and saw the diner sign buzzing in the distance, already lit against the early dark, she thought about her father, careful and quiet and dead at 39 on a black ice morning, who had believed that people would be decent if you gave them enough room. She thought I do not always believe that, but I believe it is worth insisting on. She parked and went inside. Floyd had left a plate of eggs warm on the pass-through and a note that said, "Conference go okay back at 10." She ate the eggs standing up at the counter in the quiet diner and looked out at the parking lot, in the street, in the Iron Shepherd garage 4 blocks north where the lights were still on. Then she wiped her hands, put on her apron, and started getting ready for the shift. The coffee maker hissed. The sign buzzed outside. The cold dark settled over Harlan like something familiar and understood, and Nora Calloway was exactly where she had decided to be, which was the only place she had ever been willing to stay. Some towns remembered the loud things, the arguments at the courthouse steps, the accidents on the county road, the fires that took old barns and left black squares in green fields. Those stories moved fast and burned bright, and everyone knew them. But Harlan also remembered the quiet things, and the quiet things lasted longer. People remembered the night a 24-year-old waitress with a pharmacy notebook and nothing else decided she was not going to be quiet about what was happening to her. They remembered the old woman with reading glasses on a chain who drove to the courthouse on a Tuesday morning with a copy of a document that had been buried for 5 years. They remembered the cook who told his boss to stay out of his kitchen. They remembered the woman who drove 2 hours in the cold to sit on a front step and say something she had kept inside for 4 years. They remembered 43 bikes lined up on a Saturday morning in front of a diner engines idling, saying nothing, saying everything. In April, the county installed new signage at 6 locations around Harlan. A small professional's signs in blue and white with a simple message. Safe place. Come inside. Tell someone. The signs appeared at the diner, the pharmacy, the library, the fire station, the hardware store, and the Route 9 diner, which had been under different management for 2 years, and whose new owner put the sign in the window the same afternoon. The county delivered it and did not take it down when spring turned to summer. Margot Slade ran for re-election in November and won by the widest margin in the office's history. She sent Nora a card with 2 words written inside. Thank you. Nora put it in the notebook tucked between the last filled page and the inside back cover next to Loretta's Georgia printout. Ellen Marsh drove to Harlan in May, her first visit since the case had started. She sat at the counter at Hollow Creek Diner and had coffee and county ham and peach cobbler and said it was better than she had expected. Floyd said she was welcome back anytime. She left exactly 20%. Decker came in Thursday morning as always. He sat at the far end of the counter. Nora brought his coffee. He said, I heard the Frankfurt talk went well. She said, where did you hear that? He said Loretta. She said Loretta was not at Frankfurt. He said Loretta knows everyone at Frankfurt. Nora considered this and decided it was probably true. She refilled his cup and leaned against the counter for a moment, which she did not usually do, and said, when I ran into your garage that morning, I did not think past the next 10 minutes. He said that is usually enough. She said it was not a plan. He said most things that matter are not. She looked at him. He was looking at his coffee with the same expression he brought to engines. He was thinking through, not rushed, not impatient, just present, with the whole of what was in front of him. She said, I want to do something more. After the trial, something that stays. He said, what kind of something? She said, I do not know yet. Something for women who work night shifts alone. Something about documentation and who to call and how to trust what their bodies are telling them when no one around them wants to hear it. He said, that sounds like a program. She said, it sounds like a notebook and a phone number and someone who answers. He said, I know someone who answers. She said, Ellen. He said, and others. Nora looked out the window at the empty morning street, the frost still on the pavement at 6 a.m. The hills visible above the roof lines going pale gold with the beginning of another October. She said, I thought about leaving once. After the second time, Dale said there was nothing he could do. I thought about going somewhere nobody knew Stuart Vance, and nobody had already made up their mind about what I was worth. Decker said, what stopped you? She thought about it for a moment. She said, I did not want to find out wherever I went that it had followed me anyway. She said it seemed better to make it stop here than to find out how far it could travel. He nodded. He understood that kind of reasoning. It was the same reasoning that had brought him back to a garage in eastern Kentucky when he could have gone anywhere with the skills he had. Some problems you carried, and some problems you stood in front of, and some problems you could not tell apart until you had already chosen. He finished his coffee, left the exact amount plus 20% as always, put on his jacket. At the door, he stopped and looked back, which he almost never did. He said, the boot supplier's name is Ray Daniels. Tell him Decker sent you and he will do 30% off. She said, I thought you said trade discount. He said I was being conservative. She almost smiled. He left. The door closed and the cold came in for the half second before the seal caught, and then it was warm again inside Hollow Creek Diner, and Nora Calloway stood behind the counter in her work shoes that needed replacing, and her braid that had come slightly loose from the night's work, and her apron that smelled of coffee and cinnamon pine, and she was exactly where she had decided to be. She picked up the notebook. She opened it to a new page. At the top, she wrote the date. Below that, she wrote October. Good morning, Hills Gold. Things to do. She wrote them down one by one, careful and steady, the way her father had taught her, without knowing he was teaching her, which was the way most important things got passed along. Outside, Harlan woke up around her the same as it always had. The stoplight blinked. The pharmacy unlocked its doors. The hardware store sign went on. The Hills sat where they always sat, patient and indifferent and beautiful in the morning light, holding the valley the way they had held it for 1,000 years, before any of these people arrived, and would hold it 1,000 years after. And in Pikeville, Dee Pruitt got into her car for her Tuesday shift at the county office, and in Savannah, Carrie Whitmore made coffee and looked at the letter from the state attorney general that she had pinned to the wall above her desk, and in Lexington, Ellen Marsh answered her phone before the second ring, and in Harlan, the safety stickers caught the morning light in 6 different windows on 6 different streets and said the same simple thing to anyone walking by who needed to read it. Come inside, tell someone, you will be believed.